Shalom, and welcome to What the Watchman Sees, a ministry that will sift through all of the social media noise to show you news of importance from the Most High's perspective. As watchmen, we are here both to warn of dangers and give biblical answers for dwelling in the secret place of the Most High during these times of confusion. Tell your family and friends to like, share, and subscribe as we delve into what Yahweh has for us, the apple of his eye. Let's get to work. Shalom, everyone. Say Shabbat Shalom to the Most High's people. We're going to get right into our meditation / study this afternoon. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get it all in one session, so this may end up being a several session study. But since this is Black History Month, I believe that with all of the wonderful presentations that I've seen on social media and locally, that there are a number of themes showing the rich cultural heritage that we as people of the Most High have had in this country, and to examine whether or not it was only in this country that those positive contributions to the world, to society, have been made. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and also talk about some of the hindrances, not only to the Most High's people, but also to the contributions that the Most High's people have been making over these past hundreds of years. So as we get started, then what I'd like to do is remind everyone that our studies are guided by a couple of scriptures. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, the Most High encourages us to study to show ourselves approved unto the Most High, as opposed to unto men and women, workmen who need not be ashamed, rightly dividing his word, the word of truth. And also in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, all scripture is God-breathed. In other words, the scriptures that we study, the scriptures that we read, don't come through man, to man, or from man. They come through man. And so those scriptures that come through man are actually breathed by the breath of the Most High. And so some people call that inspiration, and that's why in the King James Version it says all scripture is inspired by God, but it actually means the Most High's breath is in his word. So we give thanks for that. So I'm going to be reading from one of my blogs talking about this very subject. But before I do that, I want to go ahead and pull up what we have been looking at this quarter, because as I have mentioned on several occasions, this is a year-long endeavor with a year-long theme. And the theme, as it says here, is build a righteous nation again, using the Most High's blueprint. So whatever we're talking about during these months and weeks, it's going to have that as our foundational or as our thrust. And so we've talked already about, in the first quarter, what is the gospel. We're now in the midst of finding our tribe, building with the tribe, protecting the tribe, and then we're going to be looking at a national identity as well. So this particular meditation is actually being given with that thought in mind. So what I'm going to do then is bring on the screen a blog that I've been working on, but it's got information that I think is kind of relevant, or is very relevant to what we're looking at. The title actually is Why Can't Black People Come Together in Unity? And so this piece is written about that, and it was actually written a couple of years ago, I think, but I still haven't published it. But in the piece a couple of years ago, which was much more timely, the big thing was a movement called the ADOS movement, American Descendants of Slaves. That's what ADOS stands for. And in essence, the movement came and is continuing in the vein of everyone is advocating for their own particular group, including Black people, but Black people have been defined by those who are outside of our community. And one of the groups that is defined as Black is actually the group of people whose ancestors were brought here in chains, and their progeny is still here. Their progeny is, even among Black people, the very last group of people that are considered in any kind of positive way when it comes to public policy making. So, for instance, there are people who are from the Caribbean. There are people from the continent of Africa. There are people from Canada who come here, or from the UK who come here. All of them look like Black people, but they don't have the same background in terms of a relationship with being enslaved in the contiguous United States of America. So a piece was written about that because I'm one of those. Okay, but that's not the only identifier that ADOS has, and that's one of the other reasons why we're looking at this study called Find Your Tribe, because that's the group of people who found themselves in a particular situation, but that wasn't where the history began. But that's what this piece is about. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the any more about that background for the piece, but it really has to do with, so where are we in this place that's called the United States of America? Okay. And so if we're going to be talking about unity and the lack thereof, there are certain dynamics that need to be looked at. All of this is related to our theme. So keep that in mind. All right. So I'm just going to start reading a little bit starting here. Let us first examine what unity looks like in America as a whole. This discussion will be informed by several authors who have examined the notion of American unity by looking at the breakdown of America by ethnicity and race. The authors referenced in this piece are Colin Woodard, who wrote American Nations, Nell Irvin Painter, who wrote The History of White People, and Wilbur Zielinski, a professor at Penn, who wrote a paper at the University of Pennsylvania in 1973 speaking to the doctrine of first effective settlement. So it's going to be those three authors and those three titles that we're going to be engaging in this discussion. Okay, so the premise of Woodard's book is that the United States of America is a state comprised of, it says here, several nations, but actually as many as 11 and maybe as few as 7. Okay. So even the supposed notion of one nation under God is a misnomer. It would be good to look at the definition of both words, state and nation. So according to the Oxford Dictionary, a state is a nation or territory considered as an organized political community under one government. A nation is a large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language, inhabiting a state or a territory. In the United States of America, we live in a state comprised of a number of nations. So even when we hear the phrase one nation under God, it's never been accurate about the reality of the United States of America. Without getting into the 1954 addition to the 1942 resolution creating the flag code under God edition. In other words, when we hear the word one nation under, or when we hear the phrase one nation under God, that actually came from a document. That document is the flag code. So, written into the flag code, this under God addition was made. The flag code was written in 1942. The addition came in 1954. Not so coincidentally, the same year that Brown versus the Board of Education was decided at the Supreme Court. Okay, so the focus of the entire phrase is not accurate. The saying should more accurately have read one state over many nations. The under God reference from the outset of the Confederacy, and the Confederacy here is talking about at the inception of the country. That's what the entire country was. It was a confederacy. Okay, from the outset of the Confederacy, only advanced by the Puritans. In other words, that phrase under God was only advanced by one of the nations, the Puritans, and maybe later the Appalachians. And we're going to get into those definitions shortly. It evolved from separate entities to a confederation of states and then to a state of nations. The idea of this political entity called the United States of America was never one nation, and the God concept was not embraced by all the nations that comprised the United States of America. So the one nation concept is more of an aspiration than a reality. Okay. The notion of God, G-O-D, was advanced primarily by the Yankee Nation, which we know of as Puritans. It was never a founding principle embraced by all the nations comprising this country. In fact, the American understanding of the word nation is uniquely American because it conflates state and nation into one entity, while most of the rest of the world sees a state as a sovereign political entity. It is states that comprise the United Nations, a term coined by America, by the way. Nations, on the other hand, are, as we said earlier, groups of people with the same ethnic origin and the same culture. Now, getting back to Colin Woodard, the author of American Nations, the United States of America is a state of, at one time, 11 nations which have been brought to these shores and brought their own cultures, their own languages, their own collective expertise and experiences, etc. To put it bluntly, the United States of America has never been a united state. Rather, it has been an amalgamation of different nations, all residing in the geographical and political boundaries of the United States of America. From its beginning to the present day, those nations have been in competition with one another for power and control over the state. During this present time of great upheaval in the country, the state of this union is the same as it has been historically. The state is a divided state. The few exceptions to the rule are either a national response to the assassination of a president, or maybe during the First and Second World Wars, and to a lesser degree when 9/11 happened. Okay, but other than those exceptions, there has not been a national um, unified focus. So, in examining the actual nations comprising this nation state, Woodard lists the specific nations existing in the United States and describes in detail their characteristics and traits. So I'm just going to summarize what he says. The first group is called El Norte. These are found in the southwestern part of the United States, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California. And what those are, what that nation is comprised of, their former outpost that the Spanish had placed here underneath the Catholic Church. So when you hear about a mission in some cities are actually named Mission, Mission VO or whatever, those were actually military outposts that the Catholic Church had to rule over the people in the lands that they were conquering. And so the Spanish were a part of that. So El Norte is that one group of people. The next group of people is called the Tidewater group. Those are the children of elite aristocrats of England who believed it to be their God-given right and destiny to continue the feudal system established by their forefathers across the waters. They came to the country, this land, for two things: to conquer it and to rule over it. They believed in individualism, and that's where the American ideal of individualism comes from, but only for the elite. They were founded by a corporation, and they relied heavily on martial law to control those serfs that were brought in to exploit the land on behalf of these aristocrats and the resources thereof. Okay. Those aristocrats were never interested in equality, not even for those who worked for them, and to this day do not consider those who work for them to be their equals. So the whole notion of individualism that the United States of America venerates was always an idea reserved for the elite, the aristocrats of the nation state. Those are the Tidewater people. And again, they came from England. We'll talk a little bit more about them as we go along. So the next group is Yankeedom. Yankeedom are the New England Pilgrims and Puritans. They came to set up a new world kingdom of their Protestant God on earth. They had a moral code based on church life, but were never interested in including any individuals or groups who did not adhere to their moral codes. However, within the community, they believed in an educated populace and meritocracy, and that communities should be self-governing. And then there were the New Netherlands, which were the Dutch. They settled in what is now New York City. Those were the merchants and the traders. They had little concern about social cohesion. They were part of the first global corporations modeled after the seaports of antiquity, where commerce or money and the pursuit of it was the core value and central focus. Then there were the Midlanders. Those were the English Quakers and later some of the Germans who believed in a society organized to benefit average people. They didn't believe in top-down government. Then we go to the Deep South. That was ruled by the brutal slavers and modeled after the completely inhumane plantations of places in the Caribbean, such as Barbados. And That's still a problem. They were self-privileged aristocrats with holdings in the Caribbean. They were primarily in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and eventually Texas. They still exist. Then you have Greater Appalachia. You've heard of the Appalachians in terms of Virginia, but the Greater Appalachia is actually a people group. They are the working peasants, or were the working peasants, of the borderlands of Northern Ireland, England, and the Scottish lowlands. They loved to fight. They have a hatred for anyone that is outside of their tribe, and that included the elite. Then you have the far west, were actually Yankees from the East Coast living in places like California, um, Arizona, the Oregon, Alaska, those places. They were part, again, of those who were living in those places. Their focus was on heavy industry. They were industrialists. They had large corporations that they were ruling and controlling, and they exist to this day. And then finally, the left coast, which was most of the central to northern coastal areas of California, and that was populated by those who were under the influence of the Yankees of New England. Okay, so those nations all have specific geographical boundaries and cultures which oftentimes clash with one another. They don't neatly fit into the lines drawn for states or even political parties. And that's why you'll see sometimes a political party seems to change. Well, the party may change, but the people in those regions don't. They remain the same. That'll come up a little bit later. At this point, it's instructive to realize that these cultural groups have a 400-year history establishing themselves on these shores. And even though some of those nations, and again, all these groups that I mentioned are actually nations, all right? And even though some of those nations have long since passed into history, their legacies remain. And to explain why this would be the case, it is at this point that the writings of Wilbur Zielinski of Penn State come into play. Zielinski developed the doctrine of first effective settlement. In his paper, he posits the following: whenever an empty territory, now that's, you have to take that for what it is, because these territories were not empty. They had people on them, okay? Other nations, as a matter of fact. But by European focus standards, the territory was empty because those people were not considered people. Whenever an empty territory undergoes settlement or an earlier population is dislodged by its invaders, the specific characteristics of the first group able to affect a viable, self-perpetuating society are of crucial significance for the later social and cultural geography of the area. No matter how tiny the initial band of settlers may have been, once those nations and their cultures have taken hold in their respective regions, the culture of the region remains long after the originator's demise. I live in the South. I live in Georgia. That is in fact, the case. That is the reality of this place, even in 2022, 23. So what serves as the unifying factor in this country, culturally, politically, and socially, it is that which brought each of those nations to this area. Well, what was that? Trade and commerce, whether in the free labor of the farms or almost free labor of the farms and the factories, um, or the absolute free labor in the southern states. So, in summary, it was money and the unfettered exercise of power to make it by any means necessary. That has been the unifying factor in this nation state. Therefore, to maximize profits, cheap labor was and still is essential. This permanent philosophy is accompanied by a permanent stratification of those occupying this society. So, what allows the stratified society to perpetuate itself? It's the self interest of those in all strata except one. Because the one unifying factor in all of the nations represented is that they have been declared white by those who control the state. In the United States of America, all the white, quote unquote, white races have been combined into one. So in America, we think that there's only one white race. If individuals and groups stay within their own strata, which was an unspoken truth of this country, that it is extremely stratified by class, just as Europe is, they can remain among the white class. And so I'll say that again more simply. It's okay to be considered white as long as you stay in your strata in the white category. Okay. So the stratification is closely aligned with the country's stratified past. Those who are the aristocrats are still the aristocratic class, the top class. They control the wealth of the country and have formed huge corporations to do so. Those in the merchant class are next. They also have acquired great wealth. Next follows the class of educators and public servants, i.e., politicians, whose primary responsibility is to service the two classes above them and to produce and reproduce an information distribution system designed to maintain the national cultural status quo. The serfs, who we know as Appalachians, are still in their positions of doing the manual bidding of the wealthy and of the merchant classes. Part of their bidding is to keep the colored masses in check and in their place. Where is their place? The bottom of the society. And that's where we find people who go into the military, who populate the police forces, and also form these paramilitary groups. Lastly, the masses of Black people who were first brought here for their free labor, but now have no real function for the society other than to make sure that there is a bottom for the rest of the society to build and stand upon. That group exists as well. Okay. So it's at this juncture that when we unpack the concept of whiteness, there are three major threads which are woven into the fabric of this country: forced commercial exploitation of human and natural resources, white supremacy, Freemasonry, and religio-cultural intolerance. Those I should have labeled those as the threads of the fabric of this country. Okay, white supremacy was the vehicle through which commerce was advanced. America became great because of white supremacy. Nell Irvin Painter's book, The History of White People, advances the idea that race is a conceptual idea rather than a scientific fact. That's pretty well known in this day and time. Her book speaks of the history and nuances of whiteness. Historically, white races were not seen as a single discrete group of people, talking about Europe again. Among Europeans, there existed several classes of white races. There was no such thing as a single white race. The concept of race, ironically, formed around the same time as the systemic enslavement of Africans by the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the Spanish, and then later the British. Race in Europe was invented in order that the rapacious tendencies of commerce could be pursued without the inconvenience of conscience. It was directly tied to the enslaver versus the enslaved phenomenon. It's not, I didn't put it in the paper, but this was actually put on steroids by what we know as the Roman Catholic Church. It was the Roman Catholic Church that gave the religious freedom for people who were dark-skinned people to not be considered people. The Catholic Church Pope would issue papal bulls about that very thing. And it was those papal bulls that allowed the El Norte group to be manifested in the United States of America. Okay. It was the pseudo-scientific and religious rationale for permanently enslaving a people group based primarily on the function, not the skin color, but the function of the people group. For instance, the Northern Irish, who were originally servants and slaves, were considered black by the British elite. As time went on, it was easier to bring enslaved Africans to serve as slaves and therefore make their status permanent and generation rather than to be indentured in nature. And so that's when the status of those Irish began to change. Therefore, skin tone became an easy vehicle for identifying who should and would be considered slaves. The concept of race served to assuage the guilty conscience of those Catholics and Anglicans who knew that Scripture spoke about the real God not being a respecter of persons, because the concept of race has always been utilitarian. It has morphed into whatever seems to keep the status quo. Thus, the Irish, the Italians, the Armenians, the Ashkenazi Jewish people, who were all once considered non-white in the vernacular of Americans, now have the status of white. So in modern times, the concept of whiteness is still in a evolutionary stage. It's still changing. Okay. So now immigrants other than Western Europeans can be considered white if they support the current hierarchy. Therefore, Asians, Mexicans, South Americans, American Indians, they can now join the rest of white society. Now, this may seem anathema to the so-called white supremacists that people in my people group understand white to be, but those white supremacists or those Appalachian folk, the Appalachian Nation, their opinion doesn't count because it's the oligarchs of the United States of America that make those decisions, not them. They're only those who carry those decisions out. So as a people group, Appalachians can live with this as long as they are assured that Blacks will be permanently underneath them in society, in the social hierarchy of the United States of America. Parenthetically, that's why there's no point in us getting angry at what police are doing to us. They're doing what they were designed to do to us. So it may hurt us, but it actually helps the society stay the way that it is. Now, during the most recent time of reclassification, there's another group that also can benefit from the white classification. They are primarily in the same strata as the public servants and the Appalachians. In modern times, anyone or group willing to perpetuate the status quo can be given white status. This now includes Black people. And this is something that we need to talk more about. This now includes Black people who choose to accept and promote the historical and current stratification of this society. However, among this group, only a few select individuals can join. And I have in parentheses here, no more than 10%. In other words, a very small percentage of Black people can be considered honorary white people. Okay. But they have to have the same objectives as the rest of white society, which is to keep the people identified as Black where they belong. Now, this group of people has been around for quite some time. It's the same group of people that were able to be given their freedom by the slave masters if they performed a deed that either saved the master's life, protected his property, or invented something that helped the master in some other major way. This could include becoming informants for the slave master regarding any revolts that were brewing. Those people were given the status of what we call meritorious manumission. When you do something good for white people, they will give you a higher status than other Black people. Dr. Claude Anderson talks about this in some of his writings. But again, they're only a very small percentage of the so-called Black population. So that is the American society. Those are the nations that comprise America. Yahuwah bless you and keep you. Yahuwah make his face to shine upon you, be gracious to you. Yahuwah lift up his countenance upon you and give you his shalom.